Welcome to Off the Record News. I'm your host, Diana Longry. Thank you for tuning in. This evening, we're going to continue with our coverage of the Hillcrest development area in St. Paul at the intersection of Larpenteur and McKnight. And so with me tonight to help with this continuing report is Mr. Greg Copeland, who was here last week and who is a resident of St. Paul who has been watching this topic. Thank you, Mr. Copeland, for being here.
Great to be with you, Diana, as always.
Now, we have a lot of film footage, as we've been showing throughout the past few news shows, of the meeting of December of the Community Advisory Committee meeting. And this committee is formed of and is composed of residents from both St. Paul and Maplewood, but there's also quite a large number of consultants and people from the Port Authority who also attend this meeting. And in our first newscast of this report, we had a clip where the chair of the Community Advisory Committee made a comment that it looked like there was perhaps as many consultants and Port Authority people as there were residents and representatives from the community. Now, of course, this is not unusual if you've been watching and paying attention to the community advisory committees for the Rush Line BRT or the Gold Line BRT or any of these other initiatives that either St. Paul or Ramsey County has, and for that matter, Maplewood. It always seems like the deck is stacked and that the residents, while they have a few representatives on the committee for whatever development or project it is, that their voice is actually minimal compared to the voice of the consultants and the planners who have done all the pre-planning and have staged the agenda for the residents in their community advisory committees. Now, Mr. Copeland, I know that you have been watching this topic with regard to the way that this type of process is structured, not just only with this project, but with other projects in St. Paul as well. And in the past, you were kind of comparing it to the process with the Ford plant development area, that with that project, they actually did have more community and resident input than is typical in many of these other projects.
Well, and the other distinction here too is that the process with the old Ford site, if we'll call it that, actually went on for years. And nothing really was set, it appeared to me at least, to be a genuine process where nothing was really set in concrete, so to speak, until more time went by. Whereas this project, comes up at the last minute during the council election period. It's put on the desk of the council after it's bought by the Port Authority. Whereas in the example in Highland, you had the St. Paul City Council and the mayor structuring this elaborate input process over years, and it varied to some extent with the different administrations. And you had PED big time involved in that. You didn't have, frankly, the Port Authority involved in it. And you had a private developer, Ryan Companies, that just recently, at the end of the year, bought the property from Ford Motor Company. So there was all this pre-planning and all these decisions that were made, and given the income of the people in the area and the interest, I mean, usually where there's higher income people, there's more interest in these things. There were political signs up in yards saying, X, Y, Z, support this or don't support it. I mean, it was a big contentious issue that, frankly, this project hasn't gotten to that point at this time. And not that it couldn't get there, perhaps, but when you promise 1,000 new homes and 1,000 new jobs, and you've only got 112 acres, and you got 5 acres promised for a park and 15 acres promised for green space and drainage, how much can you put on this property, and how tall are those buildings going to be?
Right, exactly. And you had talked about the comparison, and then you made the comment, well, maybe it's possible that this process for the Hillcrest development could become as robust as that for the old Ford plant site. But as we shared on one of our first reports of this development and this particular advisory committee, there's a technical committee that's already been in operation before the Community Advisory Committee has offered their input. And we've got here the agenda from this meeting that we have our film footage of, and that's of December 17th, 2019. And part of the agenda isn't just to have the members say a little bit about where they think they could find community input on the project, but a large part of the meeting has to do with the Technical Advisory Committee giving a summary, a report of their policy and technical priorities. Now, this is, of course, before the community has been asked about what are their priorities. And here it's written here in black and white, so you can't help but think, wow, this is all pre-planned and orchestrated. It says, bullet point number 1, initial priorities. Okay, well, we know the initial priorities are 1,000 housing units, 1,000 jobs. Where did these initial priorities come from? Well, now that would be interesting. We're not to that film footage yet. And then how will they be used? They will be used to inform the draft concept plans. So you see, these priorities that have already been created by the technical team are going to be used to draft the concept plans. Not what the residents have to say, but what the Technical Advisory Committee has to say. And then it says, hot off the press here, I've got another paper, and then it says that these priorities will also be used to help direct the community engagement to most useful topics. Because there are places where the policy is wide open, and that's where they're going to want to have the community give their input. Now, we know from the Rush Line and from their advisory technical committee and everything, one of the things that the community really got to put input into was what kind of signage do they want to have at the stations. Now, that's where policy is wide open. What kind of policy, landscaping, and shrubbery do you want?
Wow, isn't that nice? Yeah, you know, that's after they cut all the trees down on the Rush Line on the Vento Trail. That's great, you know, that's great. You know what I think you got here, Diana? Does it say, by the way, what day the bulldozers show up to grade the site?
It does not.
Oh, my.
And then it says that also part of what they need to do is that they need to identify any key conflicts between community priorities and the set policy. The set policy. Now, see how telling this is? The set policy that could be helpful. See, that if they can identify what those conflicts are, that would be helpful, because then they can craft their marketing message on how to overcome those objections. Because as we've covered on these programs before, Ramsey County, and I'm sure St. Paul, and I know Maplewood, they've invested big money in consultants that help them craft their marketing message so they can overcome objections and give the talking points to the elected officials so that they can go out and continue to sell the project irrespective of what the community wants or needs.
Well, that language is precious. The fact that, you know, it's dated, what, December 17th, did you say?
Yes.
And so I guess the concrete is pretty well set to pick up on their term there on exactly what it is that is being planned. The other distinction I was going to make, too, with the Hillcrest property versus what happened in the Highland with our Ford plant site is the fact that the city council, was the chief negotiator here. They were the determining entity, if you will. In this case, the city council's only role so far in this whole thing has been to levy, a tax on the people of St. Paul for 25 years, I think it is, to buy the property, and the Port Authority is a developer. And pretty much it looks like the agreement that the city signed is giving them the authority to proceed with whatever's going to happen according to the set objectives here. So, it seems to be that this is a great study in contrast between how we do things, on the Highland property versus in the East Side property, where people are not expected to object to things. We really don't want too much involvement because we've already baked the cake pretty much here. In fact, I think the cake's out of the oven based on what you read.
You get to decide what type of frosting you would like on your cake.
Oh,
okay?
You're good.
And here,
sorry, that got me.
One of our reporters out in the field just handed me a latest report that he has obtained from the Maxfield Research and Consulting, and this is dated January 2020. So as I indicated, this is hot off the presses, and it's particularly about the Hillcrest market. It's an overview, and it goes to say that the multifamily apartments, that the vacancies remain low, that the apartment vacancy rates in the Hillcrest market area remain exceptionally low at this third quarter in 2019, and that demand for new apartments remains strong and new rental properties continue to lease up rapidly. And so this is what one of the statistics that certainly that the Port Authority is going to hang their hat on, and they're going to say, well, there is a demand, but they're saying that in essence, the demand is for multifamily housing units, which are apartments. And I have joining me now Mr. Joseph Waters, who is the fellow responsible for getting this information.
Yeah, Mayor, I found this rather interesting because I went to the meeting last night over at Hayden Heights Library, and it's they were talking about three things. They were talking about there's going to be like a community outreach meeting where they're going to invite the community to come in, but they're going to have it in places that are far away from where the development's going on basically the edge of the east side, such as the East Side YMCA, or there's a particular school which is not even in the east side, so forth, but we won't even discuss that. Well,
now that's an excellent way to get really the heart of your community engaged in a project that's happening in the heart of their community. Have the meeting points outside of the community that's affected.
Yeah, that's what they brought up. They're going like, a lot of these spots are not even near the development. They're way on the other end of the development itself.
And again, that is a tactic that we have seen in the past because, for instance, with the Rush Line BRT and the advisory committee, that when they were having their meetings specifically to discuss the ramifications and the impacts of the Rush Line BRT on White Bear Lake and White Bear Lake residents, they had the meeting in Maplewood at the Maplewood YMCA, rather than up in White Bear Lake where the White Bear Lake residents could easily attend. So we've seen this before.
Yeah, White Bear does have its own YMCA too.
They do.
It's actually near Maplewood, to be perfectly honest with you. But anyways, I found it rather interesting. We started talking about this Maxfield research project. And for those of you, particularly live in Maplewood, that have heard of Maxfield, they did the study for the Gladstone area back in, I want to say, 2011, 2012, somewhere around there. For all practical purposes, this site, if they're going to put any industrial businesses in there, is not set up for industrial businesses. It's not set up for any big box type retail. if they're going to put any type of retail, and this report particularly talks about it, they're only going to look at like a Mississippi Market or an Aldi's. That's about the only thing that would fit in there. And the type of housing that they really need in there, in order for the development to pay for itself, a higher end housing. You're talking $500,000 and above. So you're talking prices of houses that are basically on the Maplewood side of this project. The houses that they really need, 200,000 and less, they're not going to see in there, simply because the Port Authority paid $10 million for the property. I'm sure you've talked about that. While there's another $25 to $30 million worth of infrastructure that they have to put in there. And they cannot tax, that's what they say, they cannot tax the citizens of St. Paul.
Right.
Per se.
And what I find fascinating is that the statistics and what you're discussing as to what is needed to make the property at least break even, so to speak, or to work out, is inconsistent with the promise of 1,000 housing units.
Correct. That's correct.
Because you could get 1,000 housing units in there if indeed you are focusing only on, or primarily on, the multifamily apartment housing units.
Well, even
but the high-end houses, you're not going to get 1,000 of those in that property.
Oh, to be perfectly honest with you, they're not even going to get affordable apartments in this lot to make their numbers come out. You're really looking at, you would be looking at market rate apartments. And market rate apartments are anywhere from 1,100 to 1,300, as high as 1,400. So if you were, even though the demand is at the lower end, the affordable end, less than 1,000, if you were to put if you were to put the majority of the apartments that are affordable in this project would not pay for itself.
Well, thank you very much for going to that meeting and giving us that up-to-date report, because that's exactly what folks who are watching this program are looking for, so they have an opportunity to hear what is going on that nobody else is covering. Thank you, Mr. Waters.
You bet. Thank you.
Now, we have some film footage that we are going to now tune to for our next segment as we continue with the coverage of the December 17th meeting of the Community Advisory Committee. Let's take a look.
Well, there was an environmental grant that they were going after, and that meeting happened.
Okay. Did anybody from the community show up? They sure were angry about it, but.
Well, you could ask Mr. Haney or Mr. Hillman.
Okay.
Yes, we had about a half dozen to 8
Okay.
residents that were there, and they were, it was very interactive.
Good.
You'll have to create an event.
Yeah. I like to make it.
was
Bring
the-
them in under the guise of it's social and food. Yes.
Mardi Gras.
So in this particular clip, they're talking about how can they build community engagement through other activities. And previously, we had a clip where one of the members of the committee indicated that sometimes the Parks and Recs community centers have events at their community centers that are in and around the various parks in St. Paul, but that the ones that she's gone to are not necessarily well attended. And that seems to be one of the biggest struggles that many of the members have, is how do we publicize what we're doing here in order to get that community input? And really, is it up to these committee members who are residents of Maplewood or St. Paul to figure out how to get the word out? Or is it really something maybe the consultants should have had a plan put together based upon their vast experience?
Well, you know, this is, I hate to say it, but it's so par for the course over on the east side, where, you know, the cake is baked, the announcement is made, all come to supper. You know, we have a phrase, a public telling, as opposed to a public hearing, and that's kind of what's going on here. Even worse, though, is the distance from where the action is with the hearing. You know, at the intersection of Maryland and White Bear, if you go just south of the BP gas station there, you're going to run into this big junior high, the Hazelwood Academy public school. We had lots of meetings there. They have plenty of meeting space. There's no need to drag the meeting off to the YMCA, which is miles away from this site. Yes, it's on the east side, it's on Arcade, but it's, there's no need to drag everybody over there when they live next to the property. Maplewood has the YMCA just up the street, nice theater. They could, I'm sure, work something out with the city there. There, so there's great public accommodations that are within a mile, more or less, of where all these most interested people would conceivably come from. So why drag it across the east side, practically back downtown? It makes no sense. And having some participation in terms of advertising on the near east side, as opposed to the greater east side where this project is, and involving the people from Maplewood makes a whole lot more sense. And why not contact the immediate neighbors right away and let them have at it,
Right.
in an open session without all this predetermined stuff, and be honest with people about what can be done.
And keep in mind, St. Paul, just like other cities in the metropolitan area, have just been in the process of completing their 2040 comprehensive plan. And as part of that 2040 comprehensive plan, of course, St. Paul has designated this property for certain types of land use, and they have already predetermined that based upon what they would like to see there. And so in some ways, whatever they do has to fit what the city council has already designated in their comprehensive plan. Now, in this memorandum that was given to the Hillcrest Community Advisory Committee, and it is from the Technical Advisory Committee. So you see, we've got the Technical Advisory Committee sending memorandums to the Community Advisory Committee. And they talk specifically about that southern portion of the property, and that it's going to be designated as an urban neighborhood. Now, keep in mind when you're listening to this, keep in mind what we just heard that Mr. Waters found from the Maxfield report and from going to that meeting, and the type of housing that they're going to have to put in there to make the project financially viable. And this says that the southern portion is designated urban neighborhood. Any housing provided there should include some combination of townhouses, courtyard apartments, and smaller multifamily developments compatible with the general scale of urban neighborhoods. Now, we also know that they've promised 1,000 jobs. And generally speaking, we're not talking like one coffee shop, right? Or one grocery store, and then a few little nail shops and a few other smaller, retail organizations, because that probably would not employ 1,000 people. In order to employ 1,000 people, you're going to have to either have extensive office space where there are people who are engaged in cloud computing or some kind of other office use, or maybe it's a professional office use or medical or dental or something like that, or you're going to have industrial. Well, according to this Maxfield study, I just happened to notice here that it says that lease rates for traditional office space remains flat. So that means that, well, maybe these 1,000 jobs aren't going to be coming from office space, because office space, traditional office space remains flat, and that the office lease rates in industrial space, or when combined with warehouse space, has increased, showing that many businesses that need offices are electing to locate in non-traditional office space. Okay, so then that leads us to industrial uses, which is where you would find your 1,000 jobs, right? The Amazon of the world, right? Well, except that in this technical advisory memorandum, it says, under transportation, it says, avoid heavy vehicle trips on local streets. Well, how is that going to work if you've got an industrial site within the property where you've got your 1,000 jobs? You've got to have big trucks come in to move your goods. How is that even going to be possible? So you see the items that are in here, and with the study and with what they promised the city council, there's inconsistencies here. They just don't match up.
Well, and frankly, none of this information that you're giving from this Maxfield report is new. The fact is that everybody in St. Paul that's in the development business knows that there's a 21% vacancy rate downtown. There's tons of office space available right now, and I bet you can get a heck of a deal, as they used to say. So that the office thing doesn't make any sense. You can get better accommodations for office people in an area where you have mass transportation, you've got parking ramps, you've got proximity to the airport, you've got proximities to 2 interstates and other main roads. So there's no reason to be going to
right, and doesn't that model that you've just talked about fit the Ford development property to a T? Because it's close to transportation corridors, it's only a skip away from the airport. It's got a lot of those very things that you've just identified that the Hillcrest development area does not have.
Yeah, no, that's true. And they're right about the fact it's going to cost big money to put in infrastructure. I mean, you got a golf course, folks. Obviously, there's sewer lines there because the folks have been living there for a long time. But, whoever scoped out the theory that they're going to put housing in there, I think, frankly, if they got some idea of public support for less than market rate, I mean, that's our housing demand on the east side. Yes, prices are going up right now. They've been going up, but I wouldn't say that this market is all that tight on housing as such. There are certain groups that need a subsidized rent. The numbers that Joe were talking about there just a little bit ago, I mean, where I live right off of Payne Avenue, they're getting $1,400 and sometimes more for a 2-bedroom apartment, duplex type situation. So, we're talking about buildings that were built 100 years ago.
Right.
So, or more. So that's, there needs to be a whole lot more thinking going on here about what makes sense. And why fall into the trap of building all the stuff they built before when you've got a unique site like this? Those neighbors deserve some respect. If I was backing up to this beautiful golf course and I'd live there, and it's nice and green and nobody knew about all this so-called pollution, you got to respect those people. Even the fence around that property is green. It's got that green coating. So, to put the notion forward that you're going to create an industrial park or you're going to build all these smaller, expensive homes, no, I don't think it makes any sense.
And it's interesting, earlier in the program, you asked if they mention in here when the bulldozers might be showing up.
Yeah.
Because for folks who are familiar with this site, you know that there are rolling hills at this particular site. It's not a flat type of site. I mean, part of its beauty is the fact that it's got the rolling hills.
Precisely.
And it does say in this technical report, recognize that developable lots will need to be created, which may require removal of topographical barriers to development in conjunction with the mass grading, i.e. site soil balance and on-site soil management. So in other words, they're going to fill in all the gullies, cut down all those rolling hills and make it as flat as possible so that there's no hill to have the water run down.
Well, and the other thing that they're going to do before they do all of that is the same thing they're going to do on the Vento Trail. To use their terminology, their being the development staff for the Rush Line, they're going to remove all the existing vegetation. They never use the word trees because people get pretty sensitive when you start talking about taking down trees that have been creating that beautiful ambiance for the neighbors there. So, I mean, you got a community that's there, and those people are not going to be quiet when, Big Daddy government comes in there and starts pushing around the dirt and cutting the trees down.
That's right.
And everybody knows it, and that's why we ought to have that meeting, and we ought to all get to talking about what we can really do, and maybe it's going to take a little longer to identify that use, but doing something different and more, beneficial to the tax base of St. Paul. Rather than costing us money, make us some money. I mean, that should be the goal here.
But the conflict with taking time
Oh, dear.
is that what happens with the bonds. Eventually, you have to start paying on the bonds, and if you don't have a project that is moving forward and you don't have any money coming in, well, gee whiz, how is St. Paul and the Port Authority going to pay for this?
The reality on that is, Diana, that we're stuck with paying the bonds anyway. The full faith and credit was pledged in the agreement with the Port Authority, and they had bought the property before they got that agreement signed and sealed.
Yes.
So that is they, being the Port Authority, had bought it, and then they came and presented the bill to the city fathers and mothers, and they bought it, hook, line, and sinker. And then they tried to blame the now exited member of the council, Mr. Kasim. Sorry, he tried to give him all the credit.
Well, let's continue with our next clip. This is, again, from the meeting of December 17th.
Was the artist market that was mentioned, did the engagement tag on to that, or was that whole thing created because of the engagement?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
The artist market.
Oh,
That was specifically created to do the engagement,
Oh,
but it
okay.
was part of another initiative called Payne Avenue Reboot. So we hired a consultant to actually do the community engagement piece, and these were her ideas, and she has two student interns from the east side. So it's very multifaceted, where, to train in new people and get them active in the community process. And then we worked with Art in the Hollow, which is a group of artists, and then the East Side Art Salon. So we didn't just individually invite artists, we invited groups of artists, which, and then they all have their networks. So then that was the other thing, is the whole social media. Now, I'm not the best one to talk about that, but there was a website and a Facebook created for both the initiative and the event. And then everybody who was involved also did the outreach. So it was, so the artists all had it on their Facebook pages, and the businesses along Payne Avenue had it on their Facebook pages. So it really multiplied in reaching, different groups of people.
Early in that clip, it was suggested that there is always the possibility of using interns to help the city or an organization with those types of outreach efforts, to reach out to the community, to contact members of the community, to set up Facebook pages, to man booths and go to certain events to hand out flyers. Well, certainly I can say that from my observations in Maplewood, some of the best work that's been done has actually been done by the interns, because this is an opportunity for them to shine, so they have a motivation. They want to do a good job. And so I think that is a good idea. Why not get some interns working with this committee and helping to put the word out? But then we go sideways with our ideas about how to get community input and start going back to this idea of tapping into the art community to have them help with getting the publicity out so that the community can provide meaningful input on how to develop the site. And I still have kind of a hard time finding a connection between how you can build upon community input by asking the art community to have a art convention where they've got booths and people then use pipe cleaners to designate how they would like to see this property developed. And that's a clip that we showed, well, a couple of programs ago, where it was suggested again that we have people get together with Legos and pipe cleaners to designate how they want the property developed. And yet we know that the Technical Advisory Committee has already said, generally, how it is going to be developed. The pipe cleaners are superfluous.
Yeah, I think, folks on the east side they deal with reality. They're very pragmatic people because every day they get up and they go to work, or they're retired now and they're in their homes and they're trying to keep them up and that type of thing. So, they want to protect their investment, bottom line. And they're not really interested in pipe cleaners, and it's not really an arts sort of cultural area in that regard. These are people that, have their RVs and their snowmobiles and, their other type of toys, and they go off places maybe for the weekend or whatnot.
Right, and certainly they are concerned about having good paying, sustainable jobs close to home.
That would be
so that
great.
they don't have to figure out transportation all the way to Shakopee or to Plymouth or somewhere else over on the western side of the metropolitan area to find that good paying, sustainable job. It would be wonderful if there could be some type of employment that is going to be put into this development that is going to create that kind of job base. But this is the concept that the Technical Advisory Committee has with regard to that. It says that the concepts would include an employment center that could be developed by the Port Authority, and the Port Authority would like to bring 1,000 quality jobs to the site. But it doesn't go into how they're going to develop that. I think that that would be very key to understanding how you then develop around those jobs. Now, what they've been doing in some areas of the country, and we've covered this on other news programs in the past, is that if they find that there is a particular employer or a particular business sector that is looking to relocate to a large property, then once they know that and they have them secured in that place, then they then create the development around that employer. And then based upon that, then they know what type of housing types are what is going to be sought after by the employees of this employer. And so maybe the Port Authority, rather than sinking all this time and effort into talking about how they're going to put 1,000 housing units into this property, they should go out and first secure a big time employer or some kind of employment concept around an industry that they bring in, and then develop around that. And then that way the jobs will support the development because people will work there and they will live there. And isn't that what's consistent with this green philosophy of living close to where you work and work close to where you shop?
Are you talking about a sustainable, walkable community?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, imagine that.
Imagine, hey, and you're not even on the payroll down at the Planning and Economic Development Department. Diana, I saw in the paper today where they're still looking for a new director. Perhaps you should apply. Yes, indeed. No, I mean seriously, because they obviously need some strong leadership that's going to think outside the box. To use another phrase, but honestly.
And see, and these are some of the trends that are occurring in other parts of the country, and it's not hard to find out what these trends are. All you need to do is open up a commercial real estate magazine that talks about the trends, talks about developments that have been successful in other parts of the country, and maybe even talk to some of these commercial development companies or commercial management companies who are on top of these trends,
Right.
because they know and they can actually help guide the process. And I know that the Technical Advisory Committee is probably feeling that they are confident they know the trends, but to me it seems like this process is again just using the same old process that's been cut out of the same cookie cutter fabric that ends up in mediocrity.
Well, you know, it's 112 acres. It's self-contained. There aren't through roads now. I mean, you know, to cut your cost, if you could come up with a development that didn't need all those paved streets, that didn't need a whole bunch of sewage, you know, in terms of lots of lines, you could cut your development costs and get to a development that would be more satisfactory in the eyes of the community and might actually add something to the tax base.
That's right. Well, let's continue with our next film clip.
So a few meetings ago, you presented some demographics for the area, and I'm curious to know, when we're thinking about the project itself, what are those demographics that are going to utilize the space, and how, I think, for the areas that will access it, if there's an opportunity to look at that. So like I'm thinking about Maplewood Mall. Do we know the demographics of people who go into Maplewood Mall that are either residents of Maplewood, but also there's an influx of East Siders that come to Maplewood Mall? Is there an opportunity there? So I think we can leverage numbers to help identify opportunities for us. So
We're a natural gathering
yes,
place.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So if it's social media, because when I'm thinking about the 18 to maybe even 40
Yeah.
year olds, I'm not going to come to a community engagement opportunity maybe, but I would engage with you online
Yeah.
or have an info session
That's what we do.
online or on a
Right.
website, like you said, or put some
Right.
input that way versus coming physically into a space
Yeah.
for 1 month when I'm busy with kids.
And,
I'm just not
and
gonna
to
do
your
it.
point earlier, we put out earlier in this process a Survey Monkey, and we got like 5 people responded to it. But on Facebook, with all the hits, the likes and the shares and all of that, it really, really went viral.
Now, the first lady who was speaking, she's a representative on the committee. She lives in Maplewood, so she's one of the Maplewood residents, and she's asking some very good questions, which is information that should have already been provided to this community advisory committee. What are the demographics? What are the demographics of the people living around this development? What are the demographics trends? What are we expecting that, as she was indicating, you know, there might be some kind of, you know, synergy around other neighboring communities. I mean, you could go as far south as like the 3M area, obviously, because 3M is not that far from the Hillcrest development site. And the Maplewood Mall actually isn't that far away either. If you're just traveling north on McKnight, there you are. You go up to Beam Avenue and ta-da, you're at the Maplewood Mall. So you see, she's asking some really good questions. But then, and she also points out that depending upon who you're trying to reach, you use different methods. That the younger folks, the younger adults, they may not be interested in going to some community engagement event where they have to actually go and look at poster boards. They would probably find that as just irrelevant. But maybe you can contact them online. But with seniors, they're maybe not going to be online necessarily giving their input. They want to go and talk to somebody and look at what materials that you have to present. And then the next lady then confirms that, oh, they did a survey on Survey Monkey. And they had to literally no responses, like just very few. So you see, this again goes to the heart of how do you get that input that's meaningful input, and this idea that just simply having it on Facebook and that you get likes and shares, to me, is superficial input. That means nothing. Just because somebody gave you a thumbs up doesn't mean much.
Yeah, and as far as, you got these different audiences, and people understand who are serious about this, what those are, and, you take people where they're at. So if there's an event where you're going to have young people with their little strollers and the youngsters in tow, well, there's no issue about childcare. There's no issue about trying to convince them to come. It's something they're already going to. So you have to tailor part of your pitch to that audience. And then seniors are involved in all kinds of things all day long. They're not interested maybe in going to some evening meeting, but they might go out to something around lunchtime, especially if there's some food. Dare I say that? But seriously, I mean, there are ways to go to all these different audiences, and for the folks that are working, I'm sure we could come up with something that would make it attractive for them. And if you make an effort, if you spend a little money, if it's worth it to you to get citizen input, you'll get that input. And to sit back and say, well, we can't do this and we can't do that, and that's all.
And it also
nonsense.
has a bearing on what type of input, though, that you're looking for.
Well, that's the serious part, though.
Yeah.
Are they really wanting the input? I mean, because as you're reading this information and you're telling us we've made all these decisions, well, for those of us that are not willing to accept those particular pieces of paper as being the final word on high, handed down on the tablets like the Ten Commandments, we're going to go take this process by the horns and develop some thinking about what the community thinks. And frankly, before they go out and hire all these fancy consultants, or when they've got all these fancy consultants, you would think, unless they're under some severe direction by the masters with the paychecks down at City Hall, that they would, or at the Port Authority, that they would be open to the idea. And your folks coming out of these university programs these days, why heck, they all belong to Take Action Minnesota, don't they? And those are the people that knock on all the doors. So and win elections. So I know they know how to get people out. This whole thing about, well, we aren't going. No, I don't buy it for a minute.
Yes, and getting back to that idea about what kind of input are they looking for. Again, if we go back to the agenda that was set by the Technical Advisory Committee, and remember we were talking about that they have on here that they're going to be sharing their priorities and they're going to talk about those priorities. Then it says on the very last point, which is sort of the junction between these priorities that they've crafted and this idea of community input. And how do you quantify good versus bad input? I mean, because isn't that a subjective measure?
Oh, yes.
It says here on this last bullet point, what is the best way to convey these priorities? Now, keep in mind, that's the priorities of the Technical Advisory Committee, the ones who are meeting in meetings that the public cannot attend. They are non-public meetings, so you can't go to them, and we can't film them. It says, what is the best way to convey these priorities to the community in order to gain good input? Now, I find it fascinating, the word good input, because we have seen with the rush line process for the BRT that they're taking all kinds of input, but it's how they use the input. It's good in that if it matches their goal of getting the BRT ramrodded through, that is definitely good input because it supports their project. But it's also good input when they get the negative input, because then they turn that negative input into good input, so then they can craft a marketing message around that objection. And we have actually played those clips and the film footage of the marketing fellow hired by Ramsey County, where he talks about how you take the value of the community and then use that value in how you talk about your project to overcome objections. So you see, when they say good input, it's either good input in that it supports their project, or that it's good input in that they can then use it in their marketing to overcome the objections that they're hearing. So you see, this is where I find this very fascinating, the dynamics of this.
Yeah.
And most people don't realize that this is commonly the dynamic that is going on every single day in local government, whether or not it's city or county, it's going on all the time.
Well, and I think if the people who show up at these meetings are given a chance and taken seriously, and they're listened to, and people know when they're being listened to and when they're not, and Eastsiders are going to tell you pretty much how they feel without any varnish or any, preconditions. So you'll get a good read, and you can exclude certain uses of the property based on the discussion
Right.
that you get from what the planner types would call negative input, which is in fact really just honest to God input that tells you, don't put that thing next to my house that way. We don't want that. We're not sure maybe what we should put there, but we know what we don't want.
Right, exactly. Well, we have time for a few more clips, so let's show our next film clip.
And when I spoke to a survey, I think that was more of the space of concern for that. It's not as much of I need a survey as I need a way for people to engage online, and I find surveys are just concise ways to have that happen. Totally acknowledging that they do miss people when I'm not translating that survey and things like that. Yeah.
Rachel, I have a question about a survey. A survey is a quantifiable thing, and the kind of engagement we're talking about is qualitative. That is to say, anecdotal, people talking, interacting, and so forth. Was there some pressure to somehow have quantifiable data come out of this engagement process?
I don't necessarily want to call it pressure.
Yeah.
It seemed like something that especially I should say, the members of the community council were interested in having, specifically because they know we're gonna have to take action with stuff at some point, and they want to be able to vote to the community's voice without having to go to like every event they possibly can to understand what's happening. So I think quantifiable data is always nice, but I understand that something like this isn't necessarily going to be 50% of people want this thing right here.
Yeah, there are ways to make it, to shape it, to be that way, and to provide quantifiable data.
This discussion about surveys and how they can be effective or how they might not be effective, and how much information the survey takers need in order to be able to really feel comfortable that they're making the right answers, or that they want to the right answers for themselves, or that they want to even participate, because some people don't want to answer a survey if they feel like they don't have the right information. And so how much information can they get out to people that are taking the surveys? These are all very good questions. Now, I don't know that they've actually come to a resolution about that, but it's good to at least talk about it. Now, let's take a look at our next clip.
I would have a concern that with the concentration on the pop-ups and communication going out in social media, that I have a lot of neighbors who are older and are not going to come out in the winter,
Right.
or live alone, that would probably prefer written communication. And
That's where I'm sort of hung up, is what the difference between educating them on what's there. I mean, there's a whole bunch of people that think the entire 112 is so polluted that there's not going to be able to anything they can do with it. I mean, there's people that are thinking that, and
then equally as many that think it should stay a park.
It should be a park. Yeah, we've been looking at it all these years, whatever. But and they don't want streets to go through, and they don't, but how do we educate them it's one thing to get their opinions about how it could look, but there's a certain educational level to that, and I don't.
There's an educational piece of it that, to bring them into the process in such a way that they develop an understanding and they can give us really good advice too.
And this education part of the whole process is really what's got to be engaged in before you start talking about getting out the pipe cleaners. Because people need to know the information. And I think they're getting to that point here in their discussion where they're thinking, well, how do we get the information to the people? How can we get them informed? And then once they're informed, well, then we're going to get that meaningful input. But you see, that takes a long time, a very long time. And I think personally that process that would take is much longer than what the Technical Advisory Committee has allotted for this process.
Well, I'm sure that the process that developed the Ford site in Highland took a lot longer than some of the folks thought at the time. But you know what? It's worth taking the time and doing it right. You're going to get one shot at this.
Yes, that's correct. Now we have time for one last clip.
Well, and that might be in the, if you're thinking about paper communication, if you're sending out, notifications about public meetings or things like that, maybe making it something that has a postcard they can return with comments or with specific checkboxes or survey kind of things as far as keeping it broad but still allowing for space for them to get their own voice.
Yeah, from what I'm hearing, it sounds like we need to be in all sorts of different ways, which is great. That's what we're supposed to do. It's supposed to be very robust, and we're supposed to, do the paper communications, the online communications, the in-person communications at all scales. And in the beginning, we do tell the story of the place and what the opportunities are, what's happening there, what it is now, and we listen to their stories because everyone has a story about it. Some sort of relationship with it, and then from there, that's where you start to build trust, and then hopefully start getting information back. I think, and through all these different robust ways.
And generally, we've heard from many, many of these media types that they always want to tell a story. A story needs to be told so that everybody can feel warm and cuddly. Except that development isn't necessarily based on that. It has to be based on demographics, on facts and figures, on the hard reality of how the numbers work out as well. Well, thank you, Mr. Copeland, for being here.
Love being with you.
And viewers, thank you for tuning in to Off the Record News. We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.
You just said a word that is part of the issue, and that is trust. And no offense, Port Authority, there's a whole bunch of people that don't trust you guys, and or the city of St. Paul. Because right away they think, well, they're just going to do what they want to do. I've had friends say to me, why are you even doing that? They're just going to do what they want to do anyway.
Right. And I think that's where somebody said, I forget who it was, but somebody said we need to circle back to the community and say, this is what you said, and this is where it directly affected this design.
Yeah. Your idea, or someone's idea is here.
And that can happen with these traveling displays. Like, these comments are gonna be on there, and then as we morph it into a simple, like a idealistic design or whatever, we can start saying, hey, here's this amazing idea that Jim gave us at the library.